I hate the advice, just quit your job. It's become one of the most unhelpful pieces of career advice on the internet. Every week I see someone talking about how they quit their job and followed their dreams. And do you know what? Good for them. But most people can't just quit. They have rent, mortgages, responsibilities, maybe people depending on them. And even when people do leave, most don't actually quit. They make a plan, perhaps save some money, work out what's next, hand in their notice. That's not quitting, it's just making a career decision. We've become obsessed with the leap of leaving and completely ignored the runway required to do that. Now let me give you an example of this advice in practice. Oh, this story really winds me up. Last year I was on a panel with a founder of a fashion brand. She was talking about what a struggle it was when she quit her job, and she really had to question her feminism because her husband was going to have to pay the bills for the next couple of months. And I turned around and I went to her, what a lovely privileged position to be in. Now, this isn't to criticise her, but it's more to illustrate that people experience risk very differently. Different people have different levels of risk available to them because not everybody has a partner paying their bills, or parents they can move back with, or savings, or financial support. I think we need to stop romanticising just quit and give it a little bit of a reality check. One of the most damaging things you can do in your career is to compare it to someone else whose circumstances are completely different to yours. Now, let me tell you about my own experience of wanting to just quit, but not being able to. I was working at Made and it got to the point where I knew it was probably time to leave the business. There had been such changes in leadership and I really wasn't happy. And I remember one morning so distinctly calling my friend and colleague and saying to her, I just don't want to go into the office. I was in tears, being like, I just don't want to go into that environment. I really liked the work I was doing, my team and the company as a whole, but like there's so much had changed within the environment with new leadership. There was a culture shift and I was just watching people that I cared about being treated so poorly. Side note on this, what used to get me in trouble in corporate life is now what I absolutely advocate against. And as much as I wanted to just quit, I had a mortgage to pay for. I didn't have any financial buffer to lay back on. And so I knew that I needed to make a plan. I think a really important lesson here before I move on is to ask yourself before you're deciding like a new career move, do I dislike the work or do I dislike the environment I'm doing it in? Because I think those are very different problems. And often a lot of people will confuse the wrong job or the wrong company or the wrong manager, and actually they're not all the same thing. And I think what I'm about to share with you now is one of the most valuable things a coach has ever taught me. And that's the difference between runaway mode and run towards mode. Now, when you're in runaway mode, you are focused on escaping, getting away from where you are. You just want to get out. So you might be asking yourself, how can I leave this quickly? What's the fastest option to get out? And I think the danger here is you just make the quickest decision rather than the right one. And often that can mean that you recreate the same problem somewhere else. Now, the goal is to get yourself into run towards mode. You're very much focused on the direction you're heading, what you're building. So you may be asking yourself, what kind of work energizes me? What values matter to me? What environment do I thrive in? What am I trying to create? I'm going to ask you to try a little exercise here. If you left your job tomorrow, what exactly would you be moving towards? And if you can't write that answer, maybe you're still in runaway mode, or maybe you just don't feel the need to run away at all. I think the key here is to move away from what am I running away from to what am I trying to build and the direction I need to go in. Now, look, if you can't leave your job tomorrow, I don't want you to spend the next 6 months feeling trapped. I want you to spend the next 6 months building a runway. And there are 3 different types of runway. First up, the emotional runway. Now, I'm going to share a story where I had some amazing advice, actually. It was from the CEO of Made at the time. And it was something that was going on at work. And he was like, Lauren, I want you to care, but I don't want you to care too much. And what he meant by that is sometimes it's helpful to take the emotion out of things. And that is not because you stop caring, but because it allows you to stop letting every bad day dictate your future. And I want you to ask yourself, are you having a bad day or are you heading in the bad direction? Will this matter in 6 months? Am I reacting to something or am I responding to something? I think it's really helpful to create a bit of psychological distance and stop making career decisions on your worst day. I would love it if you started speaking to people outside of work about this. Maybe it's worth working with a coach or journaling, going for walks, getting a bit of perspective. I think the key takeaway here is you don't need to stop caring, but you do need to stop catastrophizing, and taking some of the emotion out of that is really helpful. Now, the second truth here is financial runway. I think this is really, really important. I'm going to give you a personal story. I left a job. I handed in my notice after 3 months and I knew that I was leaving after 6, but probably 6 weeks into that job, I knew it wasn't right for me. And so from that point of thinking, okay, maybe I'm going to leave, to the point of actually leaving was a 4.5-month period. And I saved aggressively during that time. So I gave myself a bit of a buffer that when I left, I had a few months where I didn't have to panic. At the same time, I started Airbnb my flat. I would also go and dog sit. So I would rent out my flat here. I would then go and dog sit. I would stay with family, just tried to do as much as I can to make money in the best way I knew how while I wasn't working. What I was really trying to do was create opportunities to create a bit of flexibility and again, that financial runway, so I wasn't just in absolute panic mode. And I think that really helped reduce some of the pressure because it didn't mean I necessarily had to take the absolute first thing. I think the question to ask yourself here is, what is your absolute kind of monthly survival number? What expenses could maybe be reduced temporarily? Could you build a buffer? Could you maybe test something before leaving? I think it's really, really helpful to have options where possible. And I strongly mean here, where possible. Now, the third runway is the career runway. This is the bit that most people skip. But what can you do in your current role that could help you find or work towards your future role? So a couple of things to think about here. Maybe it's talking to other people, having coffee with people, reconnecting with old colleagues. Start to explore what the direction you want to go in and how or your network can maybe help you get there. Update your LinkedIn, take a course. Maybe you could start creating content. Maybe you could start writing. Maybe you could start experimenting. I think most career changes start with a conversation first, rather than just they start at the point that you hand in your notice. And a question I want you to ask yourself is, if your current job disappeared tomorrow, who are the 5 people you'd call? And if you don't know, maybe start there. Now look, how do you know when it's really time to leave? I think this is where you bring in a bit of personal accountability. Before you make any decision about leaving, I want you to ask yourself, have I actually communicated what I want to my manager? Have I asked for opportunities? Have I given feedback? Have I been honest with myself? Have I set boundaries? I remember my first career job at Sky. I left because I just wanted more money. And I don't think I ever had the conversation. I think I was just got approached by a recruiter, saw the shiny lights of, an extra $5,000 in my pay packet, and I left. And in hindsight, actually, if I'd have had that conversation, who knows where that had gone. The opportunities, I sometimes look back and go, God, that was a great employer, but I just didn't have those conversations. I think I sometimes slightly kick myself for thinking that the answer was elsewhere and I had to leave, rather than maybe it would have been helpful to have a conversation first, and then I would have had a little bit more options. Now look, sometimes the problem is the company or it's the environment, but sometimes the problem is us. And I think knowing which one you're dealing with is the work. Finally, I'd love to explore what work that you love actually looks like. I do slightly challenge the idea of a dream job. I think I especially see it in early careers content at the moment of someone chasing their dream first job, and I'm not sure that really exists. I don't think the work you love means loving absolutely every minute of it. I mean, I certainly don't. I think we talk a lot about burnout, and if we burn out, it's mean that, we're in the wrong job. And actually, last year I had dinner with Corey Marchisoto, who's the VP of brand for Elf Cosmetics. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, it'll come up on screen. And she was saying how burnout isn't working too much. Sometimes it's just misalignment with our values. And I think that's what's really interesting, because sometimes I think we think that, if I'm exhausted at work, it's because actually I'm working too much. And actually, I don't think that's the case. I think it's that we're maybe doing work that doesn't necessarily align with our values. And I think it's really important to check in on that. I think some questions that would be really helpful to think about here is, when do you feel the most energized? When do you feel the most useful at work? When do you feel the most proud of your work? And when do you feel the most yourself? I think I know that I've personally worked very long hours and felt energized. And I've also worked very standard hours and felt incredibly drained. And again, the difference here wasn't workload. It was the alignment that was just out of kilter. Ultimately, I think the work you love isn't perfect work. It's just work that feels aligned with who you are. If there is one takeaway from this video, it's that I don't think you should just quit your job. I think that's too simplistic, and I think it's incredibly privileged. I think it ignores the reality most people are living. What I do think is, if something isn't working for you, please pay attention to it. Don't ignore it or minimize it. I don't want you to convince yourself you're magically going to feel different next year, but don't panic either. Build your emotional, financial, and career runway. And if I could go back and speak to the version of me crying before work, I'd tell her, work doesn't have to feel like this. And it shouldn't feel like this. And although I couldn't see it at the time, those experiences would eventually shape everything that came next. I really want us to move away from just quit your job, and instead I want us to create enough options that when the time comes, you get to choose. If you're not already subscribed, please do, and until next time, keep careering.